A noble one. So I found an interesting article published by MIT. So in other words, we are at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and they ask, what is language for? I mean, it might sound quite obvious. First thing I would say is communication, but of course, I'm sure they're going to go rather deep on this. So let's see if we agree or disagree. Drawing on evidence from neurobiology, cognitive science, and corpus linguistics, MIT researchers make the case that language is a tool for communication, not for thought. Let's see how they explain this, because yeah, my very first thought was indeed communication, but I mean, you do think in your own language, don't you? So let's see what they mean by that. Language is a defining feature of humanity, and for centuries philosophers and scientists have contemplated its true purpose. It is a very philosophical question, I'm gonna say, rather than necessarily a question for linguistics, for instance. But we use language to share information and exchange ideas, but is it more than that? Do we use language not just to communicate, but to think? Yeah, I would have thought yes, but then again, they say no, so let's see. In the June 19th issue of the journal Nature, McGovern Institute for Brain Research and Neuroscientist Evelina Fedorenko and colleagues argued that we do not. Language, they say, is primarily a tool for communication. Fedorenko acknowledges that there is an intuitive link between language and thought. Yeah, many people experience an inner voice that seems to narrate their own thoughts. I'm actually curious about this because, yes, I do. But I was yesterday years old. I was yesterday old when I found out that some people don't. Maybe they just think in images, but they don't actually have their own voice speaking in their head when they think. I do. Do you? Be interesting, because I didn't even know the other version existed. Isn't that crazy? And it's not unreasonable to expect that well-spoken, articulate individuals are also clear thinkers. But as compelling as these associations can be, they're not evidence that we actually use language to think. Of course, they're not evidence, because I imagine they need something a bit more concrete. Let's see, open quotes. I think there are a few strands of intuition and confusions that have led people to believe very strongly that language is the medium of thought, she says. But when they are pulled apart thread by thread, they don't really hold up to empirical scrutiny. Let's see, separating language and thought. This is actually quite interesting. For centuries, language's potential role in facilitating thinking was nearly impossible to evaluate scientifically, but neuroscientists and cognitive scientists now have tools that enable a more rigorous consideration of the idea. Evidence from both fields, with Fedorenko, MIT brain and cognitive scientist and linguist Edward Gibson, and University of California at Berkeley cognitive science Stephen Piantadosi, review in their Nature perspective, supports the idea that language is a tool for communication, not for thought. All right, so is it incidental then that many of us utilize language in their minds when they think? Because I'm not saying that it's impossible to think without imagining the sound of a word. Of course, you could think in the sense that you're imagining a beautiful mountain. Maybe, there we go. So in connection with imagination, it's not necessarily linguistic as an exercise. But when we do think, when we're like, I wonder what she meant by that, isn't that linguistic though? Like if you had no language for some reasons, like you were brought up, I think there were like cases where like it was usually a case of a word, buse, where like kids did not learn a language because they were like segregated by some crazy parents. But if they don't learn language, how deeply can they really think? That's I mean, that's a question that I suppose they are going to address. Open quotes. What we have learned by using methods that actually tell us about the engagement of the linguistic processing mechanism is that those mechanisms are not really engaged when we think. Fedorenko says. Also, she adds, you can take those mechanisms away, and it seems that thinking can go on just fine. All right, so I imagine for base thinking, sure, but for sophisticated thinking, I'm not convinced. Like, I need more than this. Over the past 20 years, Fedorenko and other neuroscientists have advanced our understanding of what happens in the brain as it generates and understands language. Now, using functional MRI to find parts of the brain that are specifically engaged when someone reads or listens to sentences or passages, they can reliably identify an individual's language processing network. Then they can monitor those brain's regions while the person performs other tasks, from solving a Sudoku puzzle to reasoning about other people's beliefs. Okay, now if you're trying to solve Sudoku puzzle, I can see how there aren't the same areas in the brain that are electrically stimulated as when you actually produce language, because you're activating pathways to actually control parts of the mouth that you don't need to control as you are thinking about the freaking Sudoku. But if you, but then again, in your head, if you're thinking something philosophical, what is the purpose of this life? Why am I here? Where do we go after we're dead? Is there anything after this life? Without, like, I understand it's not gonna activate the same region that activates when you literally manifest these thoughts into reality through your speech organs. I don't think that's disconnected. That necessarily proves that there is a disconnection from language. Because if you can't formulate those words in your head, it is a linguistic. I'm going to disagree, guys. I mean, maybe it's because I'm ignorant. Perhaps you can understand it more. But I think it is a linguistic phenomenon, even if it's not utilized in the exact same areas of the brain as when you produce language. Pretty much everything we've tested so far, we don't see any evidence of the engagement of the language mechanism. Fedorenko says your language system is basically silent when you do all sorts of thinking. That's consistent with observations from people who have lost the ability to process language due to an injury or stroke. Severely affected patients can be completely unable to process words. Yes, this does not interfere with their ability to solve math problems, play chess, or plan for future events. Okay, so basically what this tells me, it's that thinking that doesn't involve language, because not all thinking involves language, it's not influenced by your ability to your linguistic abilities. But then again, I think it's kind of weird to try to disconnect entirely, just because you can play chess without you activating anything that has to do with languages, sure. But can you really, like, everything else that has your mind, like, for instance, when you even if you're trying to memorize stuff, words, there is a linguistic aspect to it in the mind. I really think that, and the reason why I think that is, while I'm not a neuroscientist, I do know that one way to speed up monumentally your ability to speak a foreign language is to stop thinking in your mother tongue. So thinking does have a direct effect onto your ability to reach a certain degree of proficiency in your target language, and therefore the mind is part of it. I truly believe it. I think they are getting confused because they understand very well the science of it from a neurological perspective, but these people probably don't know what language learning is. Like, they've never reached fluency in multiple languages, let alone one. And so I think they should collaborate, because this is interdisciplinary. You cannot judge linguistic ability if you're not versed in languages. Now, you could tell me, well, then you can't judge the neuroscience. I agree, I can't judge it. But from this linguistic aspect of it in connection to the power of the mind, I do know that. And so that one is, I think that's I think they're missing that aspect of it. She says, if language gives us the core representation that we use for reasoning, then destroying the language system should lead to problems in thinking as well, and it really doesn't. Conversely, intellectual impairments do not always associate with language impairment. People with intellectual disability disorders or neuropsychiatric disorders that limits their ability to think and reason do not necessarily have problems with basic linguistic function. Basic, though. They do have problems with advanced linguistic functions. How do you explain that? I'm not trying to be condescending. I'm doing this to be like, at least in the way it's articulated here, this does not necessarily follow reason. Just as the language does not appear to be necessarily for thought, Fedorenko and colleagues conclude that it is also not sufficient to produce clear thinking. Language optimization. In addition to arguing that language is unlikely to be used for thinking, the scientists considered its suitability as a communication tool, drawing on findings from linguistic analyses. Analyses across dozens of diverse languages, both spoken and signed, have found recurring features that make them easy to produce and understand. Well, of course, language is about communication. I mean, it's not like you need empirical evidence to... Open quotes, it turns out that pretty much any property you look at, you can find evidence that languages are optimized in a way that makes information transfer as efficient as possible. Sure. It's not a new idea, but it has held up as linguists analyze larger corpora across more diverse sets of languages, which has become possible in recent years as the field has assembled corpora that are annotated for various linguistic features. Such studies find that across languages, sounds and words tend to be pieced together in ways that minimize effort for the language proper without muddling the message. For example, commonly used words tend to be short, while words whose meaning depends on one another tend to cluster close together in sentences. I wonder if this is valid across the whole spectrum of languages. It's possible. Likewise, linguists have noted features that help languages convey meaning despite potential signal distortions, whether due to attention lapses or ambient noise. Going back to this as well, I wonder if there is a correlation between the length of words and other factors that help declassify. For instance, tones. So I wonder if tonal languages don't need as long as a vocabulary when it comes to the length of individual words because they're using a secondary factor for it could be. Actually, that's what I think, to be honest. All of these features seem to suggest that forms of languages are optimized to make communication easier, which makes sense. Sure. Okay, so anyways, interesting. Let me know what you think. Do you agree, disagree? Be interesting to know. And thank you for joining Metatron Academy. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.